Pascendi Dominici Gregis, Part 2. It is thus, venerable brethren, that for the modernists, whether as authors or propagandists, there is to be nothing stable, nothing immutable in the Church, nor, indeed, are they without forerunners in their doctrines. For it was of these that our predecessor Pius IX wrote, "These enemies of divine revelation extol human progress to the skies, and with rash and sacrilegious daring would have it introduced into the Catholic religion, as if this religion were not the work of God, but of man, or some kind of philosophical discovery susceptible of perfection by human efforts." On the subject of revelation and dogma in particular, the doctrine of the modernists offer nothing new. We find it condemned in the syllabus of Pius IX, where it is enunciated in these terms: divine revelation is imperfect, and therefore subject to continual and indefinite progress, corresponding with the progress of human reason. And condemned still more solemnly in the Vatican Council, the doctrine of the faith which God has revealed has not been proposed to human intelligences to be perfected by them, as it were a philosophical system, but as a divine deposit entrusted to the spouse of Christ to be faithfully guarded and infallibly interpreted. Hence also the sense of the sacred dogmas is to be perpetually retained, which our Holy Mother, the Church, has once declared, nor is this sense ever to be abandoned on plea or pretext of a more profound comprehension of the truth. Nor is the development of our knowledge, even concerning the faith, barred by this pronouncement. On the contrary, it is supported and maintained. For the same counsel continues, "Let intelligence and science and wisdom, therefore, increase and progress abundantly and vigorously in individuals, and in the Mass, in the believer, and in the whole Church, throughout the ages and the centuries, but only in its own kind, that is, according to the same dogma, the same sense, the same acceptation." We have studied the modernist as philosopher, believer, and theologian. It now remains for us to consider him as historian, critic, apologist, and reformer. Let intelligence Some modernists, devoted to historical studies, seem to be deeply anxious not to be taken for philosophers. About philosophy they profess to know nothing whatever, and in this they display remarkable astuteness, for they are particularly desirous not to be suspected of any prepossession in favor of philosophical theories, which would lay them open to the charge of not being, as they call it, objective. And yet, though truth is that their history and their criticism are saturated with their philosophy, and that their historico-critical conclusions are the natural outcome of their philosophical principles, this will be patent to anyone who reflects. Their 3 first laws are contained in those 3 principles of their philosophy already dealt with: the principle of agnosticism, the theory of the transfiguration of things by faith, and that other which may be called the principle of disfiguration. Let us see what consequences flow from each of these. Agnosticism tells us that history, like science, deals entirely with phenomena, and the consequence is that God, and every intervention of God in human affairs, is to be relegated to the domain of faith as belonging to it alone. Wherefore in things where there is combined a double element, the divine and the human, as, for example, in Christ, or the Church, or the sacraments, or the many other objects of the same kind, a division and separation must be made, and the human element must be left to history, while the divine will be assigned to faith. Hence we have that distinction, so current among the modernists, between the Christ of history and the Christ of faith, the Church of history and the Church of faith, the sacraments of history and the sacraments of faith, and so in similar matters. Next we find that the human element itself, which the historian has to work on, as it appears in the documents, is to be considered as having been transfigured by faith, that is to say, raised above its historical conditions. It becomes necessary, therefore, to eliminate also the accretions which faith has added, to relegate them to faith itself and to the history of faith. Thus, when treating of Christ, the historian must set aside all that surpasses man in his natural condition, according to what psychology tells us of him, and according to what we gather from the place and period of his existence. Finally, they require, by virtue of the third principle, that even those things which are not outside the sphere of history would pass through the sieve, excluding all and relegating to faith everything which, in their judgment, is not in harmony with what they call the logic of facts, or not in character with the persons of whom they are predicated. Thus, they will not allow that Christ even uttered those words, which do not seem to be within the capacity of the multitudes that listen to him. Hence they delete from his real history and transfer to faith all the allegories found in his discourses. We may, peradventure, inquire on what principle they make these decisions. Their reply is that they argue from the character of the man, from the condition of life, from his education, from the complexus of the circumstances under which the facts took place. In short, if we understand them aright, on a principle in which the last analysis is merely subjective. Their method is to put themselves into the position and person of Christ, and then to attribute to him what they would have done under like circumstances. In this way, absolutely a priori, and acting on philosophical principles which they hold but which they profess to ignore, they proclaim that Christ, according to what they call his real history, was not God, and never did anything divine, and that as man he did and said only what they, judging from the time in which he lived, considered that he ought to have said or done. As history takes its conclusions from philosophy, so too criticism takes its conclusions from history. The critic on the data furnished him by the historian makes two parts of all his documents. Those that remain after the triple elimination, above described, go to form the real history. The rest is attributed to the history of the faith, or, as it is styled, to internal history. For the modernists distinguish very carefully between these two kinds of history, and it is to be noted that they oppose the history of the faith to real history precisely as real. Thus, as we have already said, we have a twofold Christ, a real Christ, and a Christ, the one of faith, who never really existed, a Christ who has lived at a given time and in a given place, and a Christ who never lived outside the pious meditations of the believer. The Christ, for instance, whom we find in the Gospel of St. John, which, according to them, is mere meditation from beginning to end. But the dominion of philosophy over history does not end here. Given that division of which we have spoken, of the documents into two parts, the philosopher steps in again with his dogma of vital eminence, and shows how everything in the history of the Church is to be explained by vital emanation. Since the cause or condition of every vital emanation whatsoever is to be found in some need or want, it follows that no fact can be regarded as antecedent to the need which produced it. Historically, the fact must be posterior to the need. What, then, does the historian do in view of this principle? He goes over his documents again, whether they be contained in the sacred books or elsewhere, draws up from them his list of the particular needs of the Church, whether relating to dogma or liturgy or other matters which are found in the Church thus related, and then he hands his list over to the critic. The critic takes in hand the documents dealing with the history of faith and distributes them, period by period, so that they correspond exactly with the list of needs, always guided by the principle that the narration must follow the facts, as the facts follow the needs. It may at times happen that some parts of the sacred scriptures, such as the epistles, themselves constitute the fact created by the need. Even so, the rule holds that the age of any document can only be determined by the age in which each need has manifested itself in the Church. Further, a distinction must be made between the beginning of a fact and its development, for what is born in one day requires time for growth. Hence the critic must once more go over his documents, ranged as they are through the different ages, and divide them again into two parts, separating those that regard the origin of the facts from those that deal with their development. And these he must again arrange according to their periods. Then the philosopher must come in again and enjoin upon the historian the obligation of following in all his studies the precepts and laws of evolution. It is next for the historian to scrutinize his documents once more, to examine carefully the circumstances and conditions affecting the Church during the different periods, the conserving force as she put forth, the needs both internal and external that would have stimulated her to progress, the obstacles she has had to encounter, in a word, everything that helps to determine the manner in which the laws of evolution have been fulfilled in her. This done, he finishes his work by drawing up a history of the development in its broad lines. The critic follows and fits in with the rest of the documents. He sets himself to write. The history is finished. Now we ask here, who is the author of this history? The historian? The critic? Assuredly neither of these but the philosopher. From beginning to end, everything in it is a priori, and an a priorism that reeks of heresy. These men are certainly to be pitied, of whom the apostle might well say, they became vain in their thoughts. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. At the same time, they excite resentment when they accuse the Church of arranging and confusing the texts after her own fashion, and for the needs of her cause. In this they are accusing the Church of something for which their own conscience plainly reproaches them. The result of this dismembering of the records and this partition of them throughout the centuries is naturally that the Scriptures can no longer be attributed to the authors whose names they bear. The modernists have no hesitation in affirming generally that these books, especially the Pentateuch and the first three Gospels, have been gradually formed from a primitive brief narration, by additions, by interpolations of theological or allegorical interpretations, or parts introduced only for the purpose of joining different passages together. This means, to put it briefly and clearly, that in the sacred books we must admit a vital evolution, springing from and corresponding with the evolution of faith. The traces of this evolution, they tell us, are so visible in the books that one might almost write a history of it. Indeed, this history they actually do write, and with such an easy assurance that one might believe them to have seen with their own eyes the writers at work through the ages amplifying the sacred books. To aid them in this, they call to their assistance that branch of criticism in which they call textual, and labor to show that such a fact or such a phrase is not in its right place, adducing other arguments of the same kind. They seem, in fact, to have constructed for themselves certain types of narration and discourses, upon which they base their assured verdict as to whether a thing is or is not out of place. Let him who can judge how far they are qualified in this way to make such distinctions. To hear them descant of their works on the sacred books, in which they have been able to discover so much that is defective, one would imagine that before them nobody ever turned over the pages of Scripture. The truth is that the whole multitude of doctors, far superior to them in genius, in erudition, in sanctity, have sifted the sacred books in every way, and so far from finding in them anything blameworthy, have thanked God more and more heartily the more deeply they have gone into them, for his divine bounty in having vouchsafed to speak thus to men. Unfortunately, these great doctors did not enjoy the same aids to study that are possessed by the modernists, for they did not have for their rule and guide a philosophy borrowed from the negation of God, and a criterion which consists of themselves. We believe, then, as we have set forth with sufficient clearness the historical methods of the modernists. The philosopher leads the way, the historian follows, and then in due order come the internal and textual critics. And since it is characteristic of the primary cause to communicate its virtue to causes which are secondary, it is quite clear that the criticism with which we are concerned is not any kind of criticism, but that which is rightly called agnostic, immanentists, and evolutionist criticism. Hence, anyone who adopts it and employs it makes profession thereby of the errors contained in it, and places himself in opposition to Catholic teaching. This being so, it is better a matter for surprise than it should have found acceptance to such an extent among certain Catholics. Two causes may be assigned for this. First, the close alliance which the historians and critics of this school have formed amongst themselves, independent of all differences of nationality or religion. Second, their boundless effrontery, by which, if one of then makes any utterance, the others applaud him in chorus, proclaiming that science has made another step forward, while an outsider should desire to inspect the new discovery for himself. They form a coalition against him. He who denies it is decried as one who is ignorant, while he who embraces and defends it has all their praise. In this way they entrap not a few, who, did they but realize what they were doing, would shrink back with horror. The domineering overbearance of those who teach the errors, and the thoughtless compliance of the more shallow minds who assent to them, create a corrupted atmosphere which penetrates everywhere and carries infection with it. But let us pass to the apologist. The modernist apologist depends in two ways on the philosopher. First, indirectly, inasmuch as his subject matter is history. History dictated, as we have seen, by the philosopher. And secondly, directly, inasmuch as he takes both his doctrines and his conclusions from the philosopher. Hence that common axiom of the modernist school that in the new apologetics controversies in religion must be determined by psychological and historical research. The modernist apologists, then, enter the arena, proclaiming to the rationalists that, though they are defending religion, they have no intention of employing the data of the sacred books or the histories in current use in the Church, and written upon the old lines, but real history, composed on modern principles and according to the modern method. In all this they assert that they are not using an argumentum ad hominem, because they are really of the opinion that the truth is to be found only in this kind of history. They feel that it is not necessary for them to make profession of their own sincerity in their writings. They are already known to and praised by the rationalists as fighting under the same banner, and they not only plume themselves on these economims, which would only provoke disgust in a real Catholic, but use them as a counter-compensation to the reprimands of the Church. Let us see how the modernist conducts his apologetics. The aim he sets before himself is to make one who is still without faith attain that experience of the Catholic religion which, according to the system, is the sole basis of faith. There are two ways open to him, the objective and the subjective. The first of them starts from agnosticism. It tends to show that a religion, and especially the Catholic religion, is endowed with such vitality as to compel every psychologist and historian of good faith to recognize that its history hides some element of the unknown. To this end it is necessary to prove that the Catholic religion, as it exists today, is that which was founded by Jesus Christ. That is to say, that it is nothing else than the progressive development of the germ which he has brought into the world. Hence it is imperative first of all to establish what this germ was, and this the modernist claims to be able to do so by the following formula. Christ announced the coming of the kingdom of God, which was to be realized within a brief lapse of history, and of which he was to become the Messiah, the divinely given founder and ruler. Then it must be shown how this germ, always imminent and permanent in the Catholic religion, has gone on slowly developing in the course of history, adapting itself successively to the different circumstances through which it has passed, borrowing from them by vital assimilation all the doctrinal, cultural, ecclesiastical forms that served its purpose, whilst, on the other hand, it surmounted all obstacles, vanquished all enemies, and survived all assaults and all combats. Anyone who well and duly considers this mass of obstacles, adversaries, attacks, combats, and the vitality and fecundity which the Church has shown throughout them all, must admit that if the laws of evolution are visible in her life, they fail to explain the whole of her history. The unknown rises forth from it and presents itself before us. Thus do they argue, not perceiving that their determination of the primitive germ is only an a priori assumption of agnostic and evolutionist philosophy, and that the germ itself has been gratuitously defined so that it may fit with their contention. But while they endeavor by this line of reasoning to prove and plead for the Catholic religion, these new apologists are more than willing to grant and to recognize that there are in it many things which are repulsive. Nay, they admit openly, and with ill-concealed satisfaction, that they have found that even its dogma is not exempt from errors and contradictions. They also add that this is not only excusable, but, curiously enough, that it is even right and proper. In the sacred books, there are many passages referring to science or history where, according to them, manifest errors are to be found. But, they say, the subject of these books is not science or history, but only religion and morals. In them, history and science serve only as a species of covering to enable the religious and moral experiences, wrapped up in them to penetrate more readily among the masses. The masses understood science and history as they are expressed in these books, and it is clear that the expression of science and history in a more perfect form would have proved not so much a help as a hindrance. Moreover, they add, the sacred books, being essentially religious, are necessarily quick with life. Now life has its own truths and its own logic, quite different from the rational truth and the rational logic, belonging as they do to a different order, such as truth of adaptation and of proportion, both with what they call the medium in which it lives, and with the end for which it lives. Finally, the modernist, losing all sense of control, goes so far as to proclaim as true and legitimate whatever is explained by life. We, venerable brethren, for whom there is but one and only one truth, and who hold that the sacred books, written under the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, have God for their author, declare that this is equivalent to attributing to God himself the lie of utility or officious lie, and, as we say with St. Augustine, in an authority so high, admit but one officious lie, and there will not remain a single passage of those apparently difficult to practice or to believe, which on the same most pernicious rule may not be explained as a lie uttered by the author willfully and to serve a purpose. Thus will it come about, the Holy Doctor continues, that everybody will believe in and refuse to believe what he likes or dislikes in them, namely the Scriptures. But the modernists pursue their way eagerly. They grant also that certain segments adduced to the sacred books in proof of a given doctrine, like those, for example, which are based on the prophecies, have no rational foundation to rest on. But they defend even these as artifices of preaching, which are justified by life. More than that, they are ready to admit, nay, to proclaim that Christ himself manifestly erred in determining the time when the coming of the kingdom of God was to take place. And they tell us that we must not be surprised at this, since even he himself was subject to the laws of life. After this, what is to become of the dogmas of the Church? The dogmas bristle with flagrant contradictions. But what does it matter, since, apart from the fact that vital logic accepts them, they are not repugnant to symbolical truth? Are we not dealing with the infinite? And has not the infinite an infinite variety of aspects? In short, to maintain and defend these theories, they do not hesitate to declare that the noblest homage that can be paid to the infinite is to make it the object of contradictory statements. But when they justify even contradictions, what is it that they will refuse to justify? But it is not solely by objective arguments that the non-believer may be disposed to faith. There are also those that are subjective. And for this purpose the modernist apologist returns to the doctrine of immanence. They endeavor, in fact, to persuade their non-believer that down in the very depths of his nature and his life hidden the need and the desire for some religion, and this not a religion of any kind, but the specific religion known as Catholicism, which, they say, is absolutely postulated by the perfect development of life. And here again we have grave reason to complain that there are Catholics who, while rejecting immanence as a doctrine, employ it as a method of apologetics, and who do this imprudently, that they seem to admit not merely a capacity and a suitability for the supernatural, such as has at all times been emphasized, within due limits, by Catholic apologists, but that there is in human nature a true and rigorous need for the supernatural order. Truth to tell, it is only the moderate modernists who make this appeal to an exigency for the Catholic religion. As for the others, who might be called integralists, they would show to the non-believer as hidden in his being the very germ which Christ himself had in his consciousness, and which he transmitted to mankind. Such, venerable brethren, is a summary of the description of the apologetic method of the modernists, in perfect harmony with their doctrines. Methods and doctrines replete with errors, made not for edification, but for destruction, not asking the making of Catholics, but for the seduction of those who are Catholics into heresy, and tending to the utter subversion of all religion. It remains for us now to say a few words about the modernist as reformer. From all that has preceded, it is abundantly clear how great and how eager is the passion of such men for innovation. In all Catholicism there is absolutely nothing on which it does not fasten. They wish philosophy to be reformed, especially in the ecclesiastical seminaries. They wish the scholastic philosophy to be relegated to the history of philosophy and to be classed among absolute systems, and the young men to be taught modern philosophy, which alone is true and suited to the times in which we live. They desire the reform of theology. Rational theology is to have modern philosophy for its foundation, and positive theology is to be founded on the history of dogma. As for history, it must be written and taught that only according to their methods and modern principles. Dogmas and their evolution, they affirm, are to be harmonized with science and history. In the Catechism, no dogmas are to be inserted except those that have been reformed and are within the capacity of the people. Regarding worship, they say, the number of external devotions is to be reduced, and steps must be taken to prevent their further increase, though, indeed, some of the admirers of symbolism are disposed to be more indulgent on his head. They cry out the ecclesiastical government requires to be reformed in all its branches, but especially in its disciplinary and dogmatic departments. They insist that both outwardly and inwardly it must be brought into harmony with the modern conscience, which now wholly tends towards democracy. A share in ecclesiastical government should therefore be given to the lower ranks of the clergy and even to the laity, and authority, which is too much concentrated, should be decentralized. The Roman congregations, and especially the Index and the Holy Office, must be likewise modified. The ecclesiastical authority must alter its line of conduct in the social and political world. While keeping outside political organizations, it must adapt itself to them in order to penetrate them with its spirit. With regard to morals, they adopt the principle of the Americanists that the active virtues are more important than the passive, and are to be more encouraged in practice. They ask that the clergy should return to their primitive humility and poverty, and that in their ideas and action they should admit the principles of modernism. And there are some who, gladly listening to the teaching of their Protestant masters, would desire the suppression of the celibacy of the clergy. What is there left in the Church which is not to be reformed by them and according to their principles? It may, perhaps, seem to some, venerable brethren, that we have dealt at too length on this exposition of the doctrines of the modernists. But it was necessary that we should do so, both in order to meet their customary charge that we do not understand their ideas, and to show that their system does not consist in scattered and unconnected theories, but, as it were, in a closely connected whole, so that it is not possible to admit one without admitting all. For this reason, too, we have had to give to this exposition a somewhat didactic form, and not to shrink from employing certain unwanted terms which the modernists have brought into use. And now, with our eyes fixed upon the whole system, no one will be surprised that we should define it to be the synthesis of all heresies. Undoubtedly, were anyone to attempt the task of collecting together all the errors that have been broached against the faith, and to concentrate them into one, the sap and substance of them all, he could not succeed in doing so better than the modernists have done. Nay, they have gone farther than this. For, as we have already intimated, their system means the destruction not of the Catholic religion alone, but of all religion. Hence the rationalists are not wanting in their applause, and the most frank and sincere among them congratulate themselves on having found in the modernists the most valuable of all allies. Let us turn for a moment, venerable brethren, to that most disastrous doctrine of agnosticism. By its every avenue to God on the side of the intellect is barred to man, which a better way is supposed to be opened from the side of a certain sense of the soul and action. But who does not see how mistaken is such a contention? For the sense of the soul is the response to the action of the thing, which the intellect or the outward senses set before it. Take away the intelligence, and man, already inclined to follow the senses, become their slave. Doubly mistaken, from another point of view, for all these fantasies of the religious sense will never be able to destroy common sense, and common sense tells us that emotion and everything that leads the heart captive proves a hindrance instead of a help to the discovery of truth. We speak of truth in itself, for that other purely subjective truth, the fruit of the internal sense and action, if it serves its purpose for the play of words, is of no benefit to the man who wants above all things to know whether outside himself there is a God into whose hands he is one day to fall. True, the modernists call in experience to eke out their system, but what does this experience add to what sense of the soul? Absolutely nothing beyond a certain intensity and a proportionate deepening of the conviction of the reality of the object. But these two will never make the sense of the soul into anything but sense, nor will they alter its nature, which is liable to deception when the intelligence is not there to guide it. On the contrary, they but confirm and strengthen this nature. For the more intense the sense, the more it is really sense. And as we are dealing with religious sense and the experience involved in it, it is known to you, venerable brethren, how necessary is such a matter, is prudence, and the learning by which prudence is guided. You know it from your own dealings with souls, and especially with souls in whom sentiment predominates. You know it also from your reading of works of ascetical theology, works for which the modernists have but little esteem, but which testify to a science and a solidity far greater than theirs, and to a refinement and subtlety of observation far beyond any which the modernists take credit to themselves for possessing. It seems to us nothing short of madness, or at least consummate temerity, to accept for true and without investigation these incomplete experiences which are the vaunt of the modernists. Let us for a moment put the question: if experiences have done so much force and value in their estimation, why do they not attach equal weight to the experience that so many thousands of Catholics have, that the modernists are on the wrong path? Is it that the Catholic experiences are the only ones which are false and deceptive? The vast majority of mankind holds and always will hold firmly that sense and experience alone, when not enlightened and guided by reason, cannot reach the knowledge of God. What, then, remains but atheism in the absence of all religion? Certainly it is not the doctrine of symbolism that will save us from this. For if all the intellectual elements, as they call them, of religion are nothing more than mere symbols of God, will not the very name of God or the divine personality be also a symbol? And if this be admitted, the personality of God will become a matter of doubt, and the gate will be opened to pantheism. And to pantheism, pure and simple, that other doctrine of the divine eminence leads directly. For this is the question which we ask: does or does not this eminence leave God distinct from man? If it does, in what does it differ from the Catholic doctrine? And why does it reject the doctrine of external revelation? If it does not, it is pantheism. Now the doctrine of eminence in the modernist acceptation holds and professes that every phenomena of conscience proceeds from man as man. The rigorous conclusion from this is the identity of man with God, which means pantheism. The distinction which the modernists make between science and faith leads to the same conclusion. The object of science, they say, is the reality of the knowable. The object of faith, on the contrary, is the reality of the knowable. Now, what makes the unknowable unknowable is the fact that there is no proportion between its object and the intellect, a defective proportion which nothing whatever, even in the doctrines of the modernists, can suppress. Hence the unknowable remains, and will eternally remain unknowable to the believer as well as to the philosopher. Therefore, if any religion at all is possible, it can only be the religion of an unknowable reality. And why this might not be that soul of the universe, of which certain rationalists speak, it is something which does not seem to us apparent. These reasons suffice to show superabundantly by how many roads modernism leads to atheism and to the annihilation of all religion. The error of Protestantism made the first step on this path. That of modernism makes the second. Atheism makes the next. To penetrate still deeper into the meaning of modernism and to find a suitable remedy for so deep a sore, it behooves us, venerable brethren, to investigate the causes which have engendered it and which foster its growth. That the proximate and immediate cause consists in an error of the mind cannot be open to doubt. We recognize that the remote causes may be reduced to two: curiosity and pride. Curiosity by itself, if not prudently regulated, suffices to account for all errors. Such is the opinion of our predecessor, Gregory XVI, who wrote, "A lamentable spectacle is that presented by the aberrations of human reason when it yields to the spirit of novelty, when against the warning of the apostle it seeks to know beyond what it is meant to know, and when relying too much on itself it thinks it can find the truth outside the Catholic Church, wherein truth is found without the slightest shadow of error." But it is pride which exercises an incomparably greater sway over the soul to blind it and lead it into error. And pride sits in modernism as in its own house, finding sustenance everywhere in its doctrines, and lurking in its every aspect. It is pride which fills modernists with that self-assurance by which they consider themselves and pose as the rule for all. It is pride which puffs them up with that vainglory which allows them to regard themselves as the sole possessors of knowledge, and makes them say, elated and inflated with presumption, "We are not as the rest of men," and which, lest they should seem as other men, leads them to embrace and to devise novelties even of the most absurd kind. It is pride which rouses in them the spirit of disobedience and causes them to demand a compromise between authority and liberty. It is owing to their pride that they seek to be the reformers of others, while they forget to reform themselves, and that they are found to be utterly wanting in respect for authority, even for the supreme authority. Truly there is no road which leads so directly and so quickly to modernism as pride. When a Catholic layman or a priest forgets the precept of the Christian life, which obliges us to renounce ourselves if we would follow Christ, and neglects to tear pride from his heart, then it is he who most of all is a fully ripe subject for the errors of modernism. For this reason, venerable brethren, it will be to your first duty to resist such victims of pride, to employ them only in the lowest and obscurest offices. The higher they try to rise, the lower let them be placed, so that the lowliness of their position may limit their power of causing damage. Examine most carefully your young clerics by yourselves and by the directors of your seminaries, and when you find the spirit of pride among them, reject them without compunction from the priesthood. Would to God that this had always been done with vigilance and constancy which were required. If we pass on from the moral to the intellectual causes of modernism, The first and the chief which presents itself is ignorance. Yes, these very modernists who seek to be esteemed as doctors of the Church, who speak so loftily of modern philosophy, and show such contempt for scholasticism, have embraced the one with all its false glamour, precisely because their ignorance of the other has left them without the means of being able to recognize confusion of thought and to refute sophistry. Their whole system, contained as it does errors so many and so great, has been born of the union between faith and false philosophy. Would that they had but displayed less zeal and energy in propagating it. But such is their activity and such is their unwearying labor on behalf of their cause, that one cannot but be pained to see them waste such energy in endeavoring to ruin the Church when they might have been of such service to her, had their efforts been better directed. These artifices to delude men's minds are of two kinds. The first to remove obstacles from their path, the second to devise and apply actively and patiently every resource that can serve their purpose. They recognize that the three chief difficulties which stand in their way are scholastic method of philosophy, the authority and tradition of the fathers, and the magisterium of the Church, and on these they wage unrelenting war. Against scholastic philosophy and theology they use the weapons of ridicule and contempt. Whether it is ignorance or fear, or both, that inspires this conduct in them, certainly it is that the passion for novelty is always united in them with hatred of scholasticism, and there is no surer sign that a man is tending to modernism than when he begins to show his dislike for the scholastic method. Let the modernists and their admirers remember the proposition condemned by Pius IX. The method and principles which have served the ancient doctors of scholasticism when treating of theology no longer correspond with the exigencies of our time or the progress of science. They exercise all their ingenuity in an effort to weaken the force and falsify the character of tradition, so as to rob it of all its weight and authority. But for Catholics, nothing will remove the authority of the Second Council of Nicaea, where it condemns those who dare, after the impious fashion of heretics, to deride the ecclesiastical traditions, to invent novelties of some kind, or endeavor by malice or craft to overthrow any one of the legitimate traditions of the Catholic Church, nor that of the declaration of the Fourth Council of Constantinople. We therefore profess to preserve and guard the rules bequeathed to the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church by the holy and most illustrious apostles, by the Orthodox councils, both general and local, and by every one of those divine interpreters, the fathers and doctors of the Church. Wherefore the Roman pontiffs Pius IV and Pius IX ordered the insertion in the profession of faith of the following declaration: I most firmly admit and embrace the apostolic and ecclesiastical traditions and other observances and constitutions of the Church. The modernists pass judgment on the Holy Fathers of the Church, even as they do upon tradition. With consummate temerity they assure the public that the Fathers, while personally the most worthy of all veneration, were entirely ignorant of history and criticism, for which they are only excusable on account of the time in which they lived. Finally, the modernists try in every way to diminish and weaken the authority of the ecclesiastical magisterium itself by sacrilegiously falsifying its origin, character, and rights, and by freely repeating the calumnies of its adversaries. To the entire band of modernists may be applied those words which our predecessor sorrowfully wrote: to bring contempt and odium on the mystic spouse of Christ, who is the true light, the children of darkness have been wont to cast in her face before the world a stupid calumny, and perverting the meaning and force of things and words, to depict her as a friend of darkness and ignorance, and the enemy of light, science, and progress. This being so, venerable brethren, there is little reason to wonder that the modernists vent all their bitterness and hatred on Catholics who zealously fight the battles of the Church. There is no species of insult which they do not heap upon them, but their usual course is to charge them with ignorance and obstinacy. When an adversary rises up against them with an erudition and forces that renders them redoubtable, they seek to make a conspiracy of silence around him to nullify the effects of his attack. This policy towards Catholics is more invidious in that they belaud with admiration, which knows no bounds, the writers who range themselves on their side, hailing their works, exuding novelty in every page, with a chorus of applause. For them the scholarship of a writer is in direct proportion to the recklessness of his attacks on antiquity, and of his efforts to undermine tradition and the ecclesiastical magisterium. When one of their number falls under the condemnations of the Church, the rest of them, to the disgust of good Catholics, gather round him, loudly and publicly applaud him, and hold him up in veneration as almost a martyr for truth. The young, excited and confused by all this clamor of praise and abuse, some of them afraid of being branded as ignorant, others ambitious to rank among the learned, and both classes goaded internally by curiosity and pride, not infrequently surrender and give themselves up to modernism. And here we have already some of the artifices employed by modernists to exploit their wares. What efforts do they not make to win new recruits? They seize upon professorships in the seminaries and universities, and gradually make of them chairs of pestilence. In sermons from the pulpit they disseminate their doctrines, although possibly in utterance which are veiled. In Congress they express their teachings more openly. In their social gatherings they introduce them and commend them to others. Under their own names and under pseudonyms they publish numbers of books, newspapers, reviews, and sometimes one and the same writer adopts a variety of pseudonyms to trap the incautious reader into believing in a multitude of modernist writers. In short, with feverish activity they leave nothing untried in act, speech, and writing. And with what result? We have to deplore the spectacle of many young men, once full of promise and capable of rendering great services to the Church, now gone astray. It is also a subject of grief to us that many others who, while they certainly do not go so far as the former, have yet been so infected by breathing a poisoned atmosphere as to think, speak, and write with the degree of laxity which ill becomes a Catholic. They are to be found among the laity, and in the ranks of the clergy, and they are not wanting even in the last place where one might expect them to meet, in religious communities. If they treat of biblical questions, it is upon modernist principles. If they write history, they carefully and with ill-concealed satisfaction drag into the light, on the plea of telling the whole truth, everything that appears to cast a stain upon the Church. Under the sway of certain a priori conceptions that destroy as far as they can the pious traditions of the people, and bring into disrespect certain relics highly venerable from their antiquity, they are possessed by the empty desire of having their names upon the lips of the public, and they know they would never succeed in this, were they to say only what has been said by all men. Meanwhile, it may be that they have persuaded themselves that in all this they are really serving God and the Church. In reality, they only offend both, less perhaps by their works in themselves than by the spirit in which they write, and by the encouragement they thus give to the aims of the modernists. Again, this host of grave errors and its secret and open advance, our predecessor, Leo XIII, of happy memory, worked strenuously, both in his words and his acts, especially as regards the study of the Bible. But, as we have seen, the modernists are not easily deterred by such weapons. With an affectation of great submission and respect, they proceeded to twist the words of the pontiff to their own sense, while they described his action as directed against others than themselves. Thus the evil has gone on increasing from day to day. We, therefore, venerable brethren, have decided to suffer no longer delay, and to adopt measures which are more efficacious. We exhort and conjure you to see to it that in the most grave manner no one shall be in a position to say that you have been in the slightest degree wanting in vigilance, zeal, or firmness. And what we ask of you and expect of you, we ask and expect also of all other pastors of souls, of all educators and professors of clerics, and in a very special way of the superiors of religious communities. In the first place, with regard to studies, we will and strictly ordain that scholastic philosophy be made the basis of the sacred sciences. It goes without saying that, if anything is met with among the scholastic doctors, which may be regarded as something investigated with the excess of subtlety, or taught without sufficient consideration, anything which is not in keeping with the certain results of latter times, anything, in short, which is altogether destitute of probability, we have no desire whatsoever to propose it for the imitation of present generations. And let it be clearly understood, above all things, that when we prescribe scholastic philosophy, we understand chiefly that which the angelic doctor has bequeathed to us, and we, therefore, declare that all the ordinances of our predecessors on the subject continue fully in force, and, as far as may be necessary, do we decree anew and confirm, in order that they shall be strictly observed by all. In seminaries where they have been neglected, it will be for the bishops to exact and require their observance in the future, and let this apply also to the superiors of religious orders. Further, we admonish professors to bear well in mind that they cannot set aside St. Thomas, especially in metaphysical questions, without grave disadvantage. On this philosophical foundation, the theological edifice is to be carefully raised. Promote the study of theology, venerable brethren, by all means in your power, so that your clerics on leaving the seminaries may carry with them a deep admiration and love of it, and always find in it a source of delight. For, in the vast and varied abundance of studies opening before the mind desirous of truth, it is known to everyone that theology occupies such a commanding place, that according to an ancient adage of the wise, it is the duty of the other arts and sciences to serve it, and to wait upon it after the manner of the handmaidens. We will add that we deem worthy of praise those who, with full respect for tradition, the Fathers, and the ecclesiastical magisterium, endeavor, with well-balanced judgment, and guided by Catholic principles, which is not always the case, to illustrate positive theology by throwing upon it the light of true history. It is certainly necessary that positive theology should be held in greater appreciation than it has been in the past. But this must be done without detriment to scholastic theology, and those who are to be disapproved as modernists, who exalt positive theology in such a way as to seem to despise the scholastic. With regards to secular studies, let it suffice to recall here what our predecessor has admiredly said. Apply yourselves energetically to the study of natural sciences, in which department the things that have been so brilliantly discovered and so usefully applied to the admiration of the present age will be the object of praise and condemnation to those who come after us. But this is to be done without interfering with sacred studies, as our same predecessor prescribed in these most weighty words. If you carefully search for the cause of those errors, you will find that it lies in the fact that in the days when the natural sciences absorb so much study, the more severe and lofty studies have been proportionately neglected. Some of them have almost passed into oblivion. Some of them are pursued in a half-hearted or superficial way. And, sad to say, now that the splendor of the former estate is dimmed, they have been disfigured by perverse doctrines and monstrous errors. We ordain, therefore, that the study of natural sciences in the seminaries be carried out according to this law. All these prescriptions, both our own and those of our predecessor, are to be kept in view whenever there is question of choosing directors and professors for seminaries and Catholic universities. Anyone who in any way is found to be tainted with modernism is to be excluded without compunction from these offices, whether of government or of teaching, and those who already occupy them are to be removed. The same policy is to be adopted towards those who openly or secretly lend countenance to modernism, either by extolling the modernists and excusing their culpable conduct, or by carping at scholasticism and the fathers and the magisterium of the church, or by refusing obedience to ecclesiastical authority in any of its depositories, and towards those who show a love of novelty in history, archaeology, biblical exegesis, and finally towards those who neglect the sacred sciences or appear to prefer them to the secular. In all this question of studies, venerable brethren, you cannot be too watchful or too constant, but most of all in the choice of professors, for as a rule the students are modeled after the pattern of their masters. Strong in the consciousness of your duty, act always in this manner with prudence and with vigor. Equal diligence and severity are to be used in examining and selecting candidates for holy orders. Far, far from the clergy be the love of novelty. God hateth the proud and the obstinate mind. For the future of the doctorate of theology and canon law must never be confirmed on anyone who has not first of all made the regular course of scholastic philosophy. If conferred, it shall be held as null and void. The rules laid down in 1896 by the Sacred Congregation of Bishops and Regulars for the clerics, both secular and regular, of Italy, concerning the frequenting of universities, we now decree to be extended to all nations. Clerics and priests inscribed in a Catholic institute or university must not in the future follow in civil universities those courses for which there are chairs in the Catholic institutes to which they belong. If this has been permitted anywhere in the past, we ordain that it not be allowed for the future. Let the bishops who form the governing board of such Catholic institutes or universities watch with all care that these our commands are to be constantly observed. It is also the duty of the bishops to prevent writings of the modernists, or whatever savors of modernism or promotes it, from being read when they have been published, and to hinder their publication when they have not. No books or papers or periodicals whatever of this kind are to be permitted to seminarists or university students. The injury to them would be not less than that which is caused by immoral reading. Nay, it would be greater, for such writings poison Christian life at its very fount. The same decision is to be taken concerning the writings of some Catholics, who, though not evilly disposed themselves, are ill instructed in theological studies and imbued with modern philosophy, and strive to make this harmonize with the faith, and, as they say, to turn it to the profit of the faith. The name and reputation of these authors cause them to read without suspicion, and they are, therefore, all the more dangerous in gradually preparing the way for modernism. To add some more general directions, venerable brethren, in a matter of such moment, we order that you do everything in your power to drive out of your diocese, even by solemn interdict, any pernicious books that may be in circulation there. The Holy See neglects no means to remove writing of this kind, but their number has now grown to such an extent that it is hardly possible to subject them to all censure. Hence it happens sometimes that the remedy arrives too late, for the disease has taken root during the delay. We will, therefore, that the bishops, putting aside all fear and the prudence of the flesh, despising the clamor of evil men, shall gently, by all means, but firmly, do each his own part in this work, remembering the injunctions of Leo XIII in the Apostolic Constitution Officiorum. Let the ordinaries, acting in this also as delegates of the Apostolic See, exert themselves to prescribe and to put out of reach of the faithful injurious books or other writings printed or circulated in their dioceses. In this passage the bishops, it is true, receive an authorization, but they also have a charge laid upon them. Let no bishop think that he fulfills his duty by denouncing to us one or two books, while a great many others of the same kind are being published and circulated. Nor are you to be deterred by the fact that a book has obtained elsewhere the permission which is commonly called an imprimatur, both because this may be merely simulated, and because it may have been granted through carelessness or too much indulgence or excessive trust placed in the author, which last has perhaps sometimes happened in the religious orders. Besides, just as the same food does not agree with everyone, it may happen that a book, harmless in one place, may, on account of the different circumstances, be hurtful in another. Should a bishop, therefore, having taken the advice of prudent persons, deem it right to condemn any such books in this diocese, we give him ample faculty for the purpose, and we lay upon him the obligation of doing so. Let all this be done in a fitting manner, and in certain cases it will suffice to restrict the prohibition to the clergy. But in all cases it will be obligatory on Catholic booksellers not to put on sale books condemned by the bishop. And while we are treating of this subject, we wish the bishops to see to it that booksellers do not, through the desire for gain, engage in evil trade. It is certain that in the catalogues of some of them the books of the modernists are not infrequently announced with no small praise. If they refuse obedience, let the bishops, after due admonition, have no hesitation in depriving them of the title of Catholic booksellers. This applies, and with still more reason, to those who have the title of episcopal booksellers. If they have that of pontifical booksellers, let them be denounced to the Apostolic See. Finally, we remind all of Article 26 of the above-mentioned Constitution Officiorum. All those who have obtained an apostolic faculty to read and to keep forbidden books are not only thereby authorized to read and keep books and periodical forbidden by the local ordinaries, unless the apostolic faculty expressly concedes permission to read and keep books condemned by anyone whomsoever. It is not enough to hinder the reading and the sale of bad books. It is also necessary to prevent them from being published. Hence, let the bishops use the utmost strictness in granting permission to print. Under the rules of the Constitution Officiorum, many publications require the authorization of the ordinary, and in certain dioceses, since the bishop cannot personally make himself acquainted with them all, it has been the custom to have a suitable number of official censors for the examination of writings. We have the highest esteem for this institution of censors, and we not only exhort, but we order that it be extended to all dioceses. In all episcopal curias, therefore, let censors be appointed for the revision of works intended for publication, and let the censors be chosen from both ranks of the clergy, secular and regular, men whose age, knowledge, and prudence will enable them to follow the safe and golden means in their judgments. It shall be their office to examine everything which requires permission for publication, according to Articles 51 and 62 of the above-mentioned Constitution. The censor shall give this verdict in writing. If it be favorable, the bishop will give the permission for publication of the word imprimatur, which must be preceded by the nihil obstat and the name of the censor. In the Roman Curia, official censors shall be appointed in the same way as elsewhere, and the duty of nominating them shall appertain to the master of the sacred palace, after they have been proposed to the cardinal vicar, and have been approved and accepted by the sovereign pontiff. It will also be the office of the master of the sacred palace to select the censor for each writing. Permission for publication will be granted by him as well as by the cardinal vicar or his vice-regent, and this permission, as above prescribed, must he preceded by nihil obstat and the name of the censor. Only on a very rare and exceptional occasion, and on the prudent decision of the bishop, shall it be possible to omit mention of the censor. The name of the censor shall never be made known to the authors until he shall have given a favorable decision, so that he may not have to suffer inconvenience either while he is engaged in the examination of a writing, or in case he should withhold his approval. Censors shall never be chosen from the religious orders until the opinion of the provincial, or in Rome, of the general, has been privately obtained, and the provincial or the general must give a conscientious account of the character, knowledge, and orthodoxy of the candidate. We admonish religious superiors of their most solemn duty never to allow anything to be published by any of their subjects without permission from themselves and from the ordinary. Finally, we affirm and declare that the title of censor with which a person may be honored has no value whatever, and can never be adduced to give credit to the private opinions of him who holds it. Having said this much in general, we now ordain in particular a more careful observance of Article 62 of the above-mentioned Constitution Officiorum, according to which it is forbidden to secular priests, without the previous consent of the ordinary, to undertake the editorship of papers or periodicals. This permission shall be withdrawn from any priest who makes a wrong use of it after having received an admonition thereupon. With regard to priests who are correspondents or collaborators of periodicals, as it happens not infrequently that they contribute matter infected with modernism to their papers and periodicals, let the bishops see to it that they do not offend in this manner, and if they do, let them warn the offenders and prevent them from writing. We solemnly charge in like manner the superiors of religious orders that they fulfill the same duty, and should they fail in it, let the bishops make due provision with authority from the supreme pontiff. Let there be, as far as this is possible, a special censor for newspapers and periodicals written by Catholics. It shall be his office to read in due time each number after it had been published, and if he find anything dangerous in it, let him order that it be corrected as soon as possible. The bishop shall have the same right, even when the censor has seen nothing objectionable in a publication. We have already mentioned congresses and public gatherings as among the means used by the modernists to propagate and defend their opinions. In the future, bishops shall not permit congresses of priests except on very rare occasions. When they do permit them, it shall only be on condition that facts appertaining to the bishops or the apostolic see be not treated in them, and that no resolutions or petitions be allowed that would imply an usurpation of sacred authority, and that absolutely nothing be said in them which savors of modernism, Presbyterianism, or laicism. At congresses of this kind, which can only be held after permission in writing has been obtained in due time and for each case, it shall not be lawful for priests or other dioceses to be present without the written permission of their ordinary. Further, let no priest lose sight of the solemn recommendation of Leo XIII. Let priests hold as sacred the authority of their pastors. Let them take it for certain that the sacerdotal ministry, if not exercised under the guidance of the bishops, can never either be holy or very fruitful or worthy of respect. But of what avail, venerable brethren, will be all our commands and prescriptions if they do not dutifully and firmly carried out? In order that this may be done, it has seemed expedient to us to extend to all dioceses the regulations which the bishops of Umbria, with great wisdom, laid down for theirs many years ago. In order, they say, to extirpate the errors already propagated, and to prevent their further diffusion, and to remove those teachers of impiety through whom the pernicious effects of such diffusion are being perpetuated. This sacred assembly, following the example of St. Charles Borromeo, has decided to establish in each of the dioceses a council consisting of approved members of both branches of the clergy, which shall be charged with the task of noting the existence of errors and the devices by which new ones are introduced and propagated, and to inform the bishop of the whole, so that he may take counsel with them as to the best means for suppressing the evil at the outset, and preventing it from spreading for the ruin of souls, or, worse still, gaining strength and growth. We decree, therefore, that in every diocese a council of this kind, which we are pleased to name the Council of Vigilance, be instituted without delay. The priests called to form part in it shall be chosen somewhat after the manner above prescribed for the censors, and they shall meet every 2 months on an appointed day in the presence of the bishop. They shall be bound to secrecy as to their deliberations and decisions, and in their functions shall be included the following. They shall watch most carefully for every trace and sign of modernism, both in publications and in teaching, and to preserve the clergy and the young from it, they shall take all prudent, prompt, and efficacious measures. Let them combat novelties of words, remembering the admonitions of Leo XIII. It is impossible to approve in Catholic publications a style inspired by unsound novelty, which seems to deride the piety of the faithful and dwells on the introduction of a new order of Christian life, on new directions of the clergy, on new aspirations of the modern soul, on a new social vocation of the clergy, on a new Christian civilization, and many other things of the same kind. The language of the kind here indicated is not to be tolerated either in books or in lectures. The councils must not neglect the books treating of the pious traditions of different places or of sacred relics. Let them not permit such questions to be discussed in journals or periodicals destined to foster piety, either with expressions savoring of mockery or contempt, or by dogmatic pronouncements, especially when, as is often the case, what is stated as a certainty either does not pass the limits of probability or is based on prejudiced opinion. Concerning sacred relics, let this be the rule. If bishops, who alone are judges in such matters, know for certain that a relic is not genuine, let them remove it at once from the veneration of the faithful. If the authentications of a relic happen to have been lost through civil disturbances, or in any other way, let it not be exposed for public veneration until the bishop has verified it. The argument of a prescription of well-founded presumption is to have weight only when devotion to the relic is commendable by reason of its antiquity, according to the sense of the decree issued in 1896 by the Congregation of Indulgences and Sacred Relics. Ancient relics are to retain the veneration they have always enjoyed, except when in individual instances there are clear arguments that they are false or superstitious. In passing judgment on pious traditions, let it always be borne in mind that in this matter the Church uses the greatest prudence, and that she does not allow traditions of this kind to be narrated in books except with the utmost caution and the insertion of the declaration imposed by Urban VIII. And even then she does not guarantee the truth of the facts narrated. She simply does not forbid belief in things which human evidence is not wanting. On this matter, the Sacred Congregation of Rites, 30 years ago, decreed as follows: "These apparitions or revelations have neither been approved nor condemned by the Holy See, which has simply allowed them to be believed on purely human faith, on the tradition which they relate, corroborated by testimony and documents worthy of credence. Anyone who follows this rule has no cause to fear, for the devotion based on any apparition, insofar as it regards the fact itself, that is to say, insofar as the devotion is relative, always implies the condition of the fact being true, while in so far as it is absolute, it is always based on the truth, seeing that its object is the persons of the saints who are honored. The same is true of relics. Finally, we entrust to the councils of vigilance the duty of overlooking assiduously and diligently social institutions as well as writings on social questions, so that they may harbor no trace of modernism, but obey the prescriptions of the Roman pontiffs. Lest what we have laid down thus far should pass into oblivion, we will and ordain that the bishops of all dioceses, a year after the publication of these letters, and every 3 years thenceforward, furnish the Holy See with a diligent and sworn report on the things which have been decreed in this our letter, and on the doctrines that find currency among the clergy, and especially in the seminaries and other Catholic institutions, those not expected which are not subject to the ordinary, and we impose the like obligation on the generals of religious orders with regard to those who are under them. This, venerable brethren, is what we have thought it our duty to write to you for the salvation of all who believe. The adversaries of the Church will doubtless abuse what we have said to refurbish the old calumny, which we are traduced as the enemy of science and of progress of humanity. As a fresh answer to such accusations, which the history of the Christian religion refutes by never failing evidence, it is our intention to establish by every means in our power a special institute in which, through the cooperation of those Catholics who are most eminent for their learning, the advance of science and every other department of knowledge may be promoted under the guidance and teaching of Catholic truth. God grant that we may happily realize our design with the assistance of all those who bear a sincere love for the Church of Christ. But of this we propose to speak on another occasion. Meanwhile, venerable brethren, fully confident in your zeal and energy, we beseech for you with our whole heart the abundance of heavenly light, so that in the midst of this great danger to souls from the insidious invasions of error upon every hand, you may see clearly what ought to be done, and labor to do it with all your strength and courage. May Jesus Christ, the author and finisher of our faith, be with you in his power, and may the Immaculate Virgin, the destroyer of all heresies, be with you by her prayers and aid. And we, as a pledge of our affection and of the divine solace in adversity, most lovingly grant you, your clergy and people, the apostolic benediction. Given at St. Peter's, Rome, September 8, 1907, in the 5th year of our pontificate.